Hello students. In today's class we are going to take up the second presentation on William Wordsworth. This is the topic that we are going to deal with. In the last class we had been through the introduction of William Wordsworth, his views on language of poetry as expressed in his lyrical ballads, its limitations, the concept of poetry, similarly the nature and definition of poetry. Friends, in today's class we are going to take up the functions of poetry. Yes, the functions of poetry. In functions of poetry, Wordsworth talks about poetic pleasure and truth. Friends, Wordsworth believes that pleasure is the chief end of poetry. He believed that poetry gives pleasure to the reader. And the overall objective of poetry is only to give pleasure. Yes, next, poetry is the truth of man's knowledge of himself and the world around him. Secondly, he believes that poetry gives a knowledge of world around him. True of man's knowledge, truth, it's the truth of man's knowledge. Ultimately, he says, poetry is a great force of good, something moral it has. It gives or it helps the reader to learn something good from the poetry. So his own object of writing poetry was to console the afflicted, that is to add sunshine to daylight by making the happy happier. To add sunshine to the daylight means what? To make the happiest person to be more happy. Happier person to be happiest. That's what we can say. Yes. And to teach the young and gracious of every age to see, to think, to feel. That is, to teach people the emotions. So, poetry, according to Wordsworth, teaches young as well as the every person to feel, to think. So, ultimately, poetry teaches something. Therefore, he says every great poet, not simply poet, every great poet is a teacher. So, this is what Wordsworth believes. So, poetry's function is to give pleasure. At the same time, simultaneously, poetry makes man to learn the things. For that, Wordsworth believes it should have a particular subject matter. Not every poetry will help the reader to learn the things. It should have a particular subject matter, and what sort of subject? It should have the incidents from the life of human beings. It should have some situations, the characters which we see around. So, taken from, and these characters should be from the rustic life. That is what he believes. So he emphasizes on low and rustic life Because in that condition only, men are free from external influences. They are free to express themselves. They are not burdened. No external force can influence them. They speak only from their personal experience. And even their passions are less under restraint. They are not under the control of anyone. They are not under the control of anyone. That's what Wordsworth believes. So here, subject matter of poetry is also equally important. In addition to the subject matter, poet's imagination is equally important. What poet imagines from that particular incident, from that situation, so that his imagination colors the poetry, colors the situation, colors the things, and it gives a new creation out of it. It becomes an unusual poetry. So this should be the subject matter of a poetry. Yes. According to Wordsworth, the poet adds colors of his imagination, and then a poet is a person who writes not for his own pleasure, but to communicate his own thoughts and emotions to readers. So he speaks about the poet's attitude towards the reader. In other words, he considers it as a qualification. How a poet should be? He should write for giving pleasure to others. He must be able to communicate his own thoughts and emotions to readers. That should be the basic quality of a poet. So according to Wordsworth, poet is a man of more lively sensibility. That is his own qualification. It may be an inborn quality. More lively sensibility. Friends, this is very important. Yes, this is one of the qualifications of a poet. He must be sensible. So he reacts more strongly to external impressions. Because of this sensibility, he overreacts. Or he, reacts very strongly. And compared to a common man, the emotions and passions of a poet are very powerful. That's why we call a poet as a man of strong imagination, a man of greater imagination. And he colors the situations, he colors the incidents with his imagination. According to Wordsworth, a poet has a great knowledge of human nature, which makes him more sensible to human beings. He is able to read the passions of others. He can share the emotions of others. He can observe the emotions of others, and he can write on it. So he calls him a man of greater zeal for life. That's how he defines a poet, the quality of a poet. Unless he possesses such an enthusiasm for the people, for the emotions of the people, he cannot write a good poetry. Therefore, if a poet has an enthusiasm for the ordinary people, rather than ordinary people, they have enthusiasm rather than the ordinary people, they have sincerity and reflective by nature, then only they can write a good poetry. So all these things, what are they? Yes, emotion, passion, yes, strong reflections, strong impressions, imagination or greater imagination, yes, knowledge of human nature. So all these things contribute a poet to write a good poetry. Yes, here Wordsworth is trying to make a distinction between a poet and a man of science. A poet and a man of science. Here Wordsworth defines poetry as breadth and finer spirit of all knowledge. Poetry is the breath, see breath, shwas, right, and finer spirit of all knowledge. It is the impassioned expression which is the countenance of all science. So according to Wordsworth, poetry is the first and the last of all knowledge. Nothing can exceed poetry. So he believes poetry is immortal, no death. It is an unending process. It is a continuous process. He believes that the poet is far superior to man of science, because a man of science gives the superficial and entirely intellectual knowledge. It is not shared by all. The scientist only is the benefactor. The scientist is only the benefactor, which means he is only benefited. The ordinary man cannot understand what the scientist or the man of science is talking about. On the other hand, the truth of poet can be shared by all. It can be a universal experience. Therefore, the poet's thoughts or imagination can be shared by all and in all the ages and in all the countries. Yes, this is true. Even today, we read John Milton. Even today, we read Shakespeare. Sonnets, the great sonnets, Elizabethan sonnets. Right? So, poetry can be shared, or the truth of poet can be shared in all ages and in all the times. And therefore, while reading a poetry, every man can join it. Every man enjoys it. Every man takes pleasure in it, because it pleases all, whereas science pleases only few or some. William Wordsworth moves ahead to talk about selection of language. We have already seen in his preface treatise of Preface to Lyrical Ballads, he talks about the language of poetry. So, as he explained, the language really spoken by simple rustic people. So Wordsworth was against the use of artificial or decorative language. So let us see what he tells us about the functions of poetry. According to Wordsworth, yes, the function of poetry, as he explained, is to instruct and to delight. Traditionally, this was the belief, but for Wordsworth, it is only to give pleasure, that we have already seen in the earlier class, in the last class, right? Yes, but some of the views of Wordsworth tells us teaching is also one of the functions of poetry, because Wordsworth calls poetry the most philosophical of all writings. He calls the breath and the spirit of all knowledge, right? That is the reason teaching is also one of the functions. So, he also calls every poet as a great teacher. So, he believes, it witnesses his statement that a great poet is a teacher. And then after teaching, delight is another function of poetry, right? So, pleasure, as he said, is one of the main functions of poetry. In this, he differs from neoclassics, who gave importance to both instruct and delight. Wordsworth's conception of poetry is not something aesthetic only, but his conception of pleasure is moral. It is something moral. According to Wordsworth, poetry aims at pleasure which is much higher, which results from the realization of truth. So he says that poetry makes the readers saner and purer than before. Such a beautiful words or things he has explained to us in his lyrical ballads. So what does he say? He says that poetry makes the readers saner, wiser, and purer, very candid than before. Wordsworth also believed that poetry is a source of consolation and strength. It gives a kind of moral strength, mental strength. So the poetry consoles the afflicted, adds sunshine to delight. That we have already seen, right? It makes him more and more happy, the reader more and more happy. It makes the reader feel much better, become more active and virtuous. Therefore, the poet is the rock of defense of our human nature. Apart from that, knowledge and truth is one of the functions of poetry. It gives knowledge of truth. It communicates the truth to his readers. So Wordsworth says poetry increases our knowledge of human life and human nature. It makes us wiser and also nobler and better. See, he has used all these adjectives. Yes, wiser, nobler. So the truths of poetry are universal and general. Therefore, each and every reader gets a kind of pleasure. In other words, the poetry appeals the reader. Hence, Wordsworth believes poetry is a force for good. It makes the reader to learn something good. He talked of benign tendencies of poetry in his preface. He called it as relationship and love. So, Wordsworth reconciles that pleasure and teaching. He fuses these two things, pleasure and teaching, as a whole for understanding a poetry. So, this is all about Wordsworth. So, the ultimate aim of a poetry for Wordsworth is to give pleasure and to teach. To teach what? To teach morals. So, this is all about Wordsworth's critical views or Wordsworth views on poetry. Friends, I hope you are now familiar with Wordsworth and his views on functions of poetry and his views on nature of poetry and his views on his definition of poetry. If you have any doubts, you can contact me through WhatsApp and you can clarify your doubts. Thank you for watching the video.